Okay, everyone, we're very close to getting started, so looks like there's plenty of seats. Are you ready? Oh, okay. Okay, so I'd like to introduce Ignorance and Peace Narratives in Cyberspace. The speaker today is Angela Crow, and after this, we'll have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. Please give her a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to have an opportunity to speak to this Congress. And I'm getting used to this mic, so let me, it's going in and out in my talk, so I'm having to adjust. So, okay, implicitly in this talk, I'm thinking about the relationship between ignorance, surveillance, and cyber privacy. Most of the time, people like me, who I would categorize as largely illiterate on significant trends in cyber worlds, make few decisions that could impact others in any large numbers. Thus, I have lived long with the reality that I and others like me remain only at the edges of cyber awareness and at the mercy of others' wisdom, their literacy. This positioning has felt feasible because I have chosen to focus on other areas for literacy acquisition. However, my roles are changing, and at the same time, I'm increasingly concerned about the ways in which local information technology strategies at our university participate with larger national globalized data collection strategies, which seems to occur without extensive oversight or regulatory framings. For this talk, I'm going to look at a specific example of the administrative decisions about the assessment of students' writing at my university. I want to spend time looking at 3 interrelated directions. First, by spending the bulk of this time discussing shifts in university and industry relations to data and the impact on administrative tasks, such as organizing a pretty large assessment framework. And second, by discussing that specific problem in terms of the larger issues of assessment being influenced by philanthropists like Bill Gates and drawing on internet savvy and algorithmic savvy companies whose strategies for surveillance may have long futures and worrisome and troubling implications. And third, if there's time, I want to discuss the challenges of my current ignorant and illiterate position and possibly some ways of employing resources in the midst of shifting challenges to privacy concerns. I'm looking specifically for the purposes of this talk at policy decisions that we're in the midst of formulating regarding the assessment of students' writing, which takes place in a 2-course sequence, a pair of courses that students take in their first year at our university, a sort of core requirement that is typical at many universities across the states. So, as you know too well, privacy concerns are increasingly complicated to articulate and protect. While regulations exist in the United States to protect the privacy of students once they are at a university, these regulations are often behind technological changes and capabilities. For example, students must formally waive their FERPA rights if they want professors to talk to their parents. But of course, privacy concerns are much more complicated now, and at times, referring to FERPA feels rather inadequate. And FERPA is the government regulations on privacy for students. I think that's particularly inadequate in terms of shifting possibilities for data. Privacy, in terms of internet considerations, has long been on the horizon for people in my discipline because we have wanted to know how to work with students in public venues and have needed to know how to advise students so that their identities can remain somewhat inaccessible should they choose to participate in public venues in which we might assign writing. Many of us have taught this type of course writing sequence with internet tools for many years, which include discussion boards, listservs and blogs, wikis, forums, social network venues, and at this point, video possibilities. Given the public nature of much of what students do, given the ways in which many of us in our discipline have participated in what David Lyons might term the training of docile bodies for current possibilities for surveillance, his specific words are, the more stringent and rigorous the panoptic regime, the more it generates active resistance, whereas the more soft and subtle the panoptic strategies, the more it produces the desired docile body. I think we want to believe that benefits might well outweigh the risks associated with such moves, but it's probably also accurate to say that we have been seduced to embrace the soft and subtle panoptic strategies. While I have in the past come to some sort of position with regards to this seduction that I can live with. I think I'm more concerned than I have been at any point thus far in terms of what I think we should be saying about the extended rhetorical situation in which students compose. In part, I think three factors contribute to my growing disease. First, the increasing interest in assessment at a local and national level. Second, the always increasing use of social networking technologies and platforms and data capabilities, together with the third concern, which is I think the biggest issue for me, which is that our information technology services at our institution are moving away from local resourcing and towards corporate and globalized resources. From my perspective, looking at university decisions over the past 5 years, the people who manage information technology services at our university have chosen ways of managing data that rely increasingly on external companies because those companies have far greater resources for security protection, while locally I don't have someone marking this connection. National articles suggest this reasoning behind these migrations. It seems that one of the benefits of a move away from providing services and choosing companies that can provide these services is that these companies then hold the liability for breaches in security. If someone gains access to student data, for example, the university's liability is differently articulated. But this set of migrations comes with a rather interesting set of trade-offs, both at a financial level and at a data management level. For example, 3 years ago, the university moved to Google Apps for students, so the students now use an educational version of Gmail, Google Docs, Google Sites, which allowed the university to shift away from students having relatively easy access to the university servers, thus reducing, to some degree, the amount of time the university spent navigating security issues. I don't know that I need to say any more about these kinds of examples of data management outsourced to Google. I'm speaking to people who know far more about Google's capabilities than I know. But even as a not-so-literate participant, I understand that the move to Google, despite the ways in which privacy of data may be addressed in terms of FERPA concerns, remains nonetheless a complicated example of an exchange in current privacy definitions. Who has access to students' data, in what ways, with what privacy hazards remains a question, and what kinds of access we have to that same student data becomes a specific concern for me as we try to understand the best ways to gather and analyze a large amount of writing from students who enroll in our composition writing courses, a mandatory course in their first-year curriculum at our university. The same course is a mandatory course across universities in the United States, and we struggle as a discipline to figure out how to best assess students' writing in these larger venues. I want to pause here only long enough to say that in the next section, I want to talk about the increasing pressures to assess students' progress at a national level. We are in the midst of a race towards assessment, with many companies understanding the financial value of being able to prove that they can offer the best resources to validate students' work, aka a company like turnitin.com, which validates whether or not a student has plagiarized writing. To assess students' entry level, these same companies try to assess students' entry level preparation, to assess the quality of written work that a student completes, and as two of my colleagues have repeatedly pointed out, this rise in the assessment industry has not seen a corresponding rise in regulatory agencies that might set and enforce viable policies. What's more, in the midst of budget cuts and extreme financial challenges, we are asked to prove the worthiness of our first-year writing courses using data that would most easily be gathered at this point by drawing on data cloud resources from the internet, at least for some portion of that required labor. In other words, in the midst of an extraordinary budget crisis and with increased pressures to prove the validity of our courses, we find ourselves trying to create viable options that reduce the enormity of the task before us. And because companies have understood the pressures and expectations, they have created the resources we might need. Nonetheless, we find ourselves worrying over the potential threats of looking into data cloud options in this midst of our ignorance about how data will be used by these various corporations. I nonetheless need to make viable and often hasty decisions about which resources to try. And I should add that the stakes are high in a variety of regards, not only in terms of student privacy, but also in terms of disciplinary identity concerns and in terms of local faculty concerns. The assessment trend within our discipline and others is towards gathering portfolios of students' work in online venues over the course of their undergraduate careers, and universities often select portfolio services offered by companies who also facilitate the assessment process. Who pays for this resource? Inevitably, at our institution, I think students will pay. Whether students pay the service explicitly in a composition course, or they pay implicitly because the university negotiates a contract with a service like Chalk and Wire. At a school like ours, it might pay for this kind of resource with fees collected from students' technology funds. This troubles me, to say the least. So the desire is to somehow come up with an alternative, but then I run into security issues and concerns, and an IT department that is hesitant to increase its security risks. So when we look at the data cloud options that might facilitate our assessment process for a program like ours, and we're looking at trying to assess 3,000 students writing each year, we come up against the privacy and surveillance challenges that I would like to explore, particularly from the angle of someone who doesn't quite know what these companies are capable of doing. My rhetoric always when I talk about assessment requirements that we face is to argue that whatever assessment we create needs to help us learn more about our program so that we can facilitate the jobs of teachers and thereby the learning for students. But increasingly, I think the assessment process will be determined by forces and people who have different takes on the assessment than I think we want to take in our discipline. And as we make these decisions, I want to keep in mind 3 small examples. The first one involves a nun study that was done involving some from the University of Kentucky. They had a group of nuns who agreed to donate their brains to science after they died, and so one of the things that was possible was to go back to their early entry autobiographical essays, and from that essays correlate who was most likely to get Alzheimer's as they aged. So there was some indicators of that Alzheimer's in the early writing. Susan Kemper, a cognitive psychologist and psycholinguist, was able to take the autobiographies from these humanities-based school teachers that they asked to write these documents when they entered the convent and predict the probability of Alzheimer's from their sentence structures at 18. Luckily, replications of this kinds of research are difficult, and I say luckily because these kinds of findings might have potential hazards for those whose writing at 18 indicates whatever kinds of problems. Specifically, living in a country in which healthcare is not a fundamental right, insurance companies might want to access this kind of data. I give this example of using old-school framings of files and hard copies of data because I want to suggest the durability of data, but also the potential hazards. And second example that I think about as we decide issues is that most of the text that our students submit online will then be used by particular companies in what we could call forensic stylistics in linguistic studies, so that their particular writing can be used to help detect plagiarism and also to detect patterns in texts, patterns that can be correlated to particular scores with machine-based analysis of students' writing strategies. When I think about using data from our students in an online program focused on linguistic patterns, I'm participating in a similar set of moves to those that exist at places like Pearson or ETS, the Educational Testing Service, and ACT. I think anytime we're submitting data at this point, they're using that data for their needs. Finally, in the era of the Virginia Tech shootings, a situation that was very curious for issues of student privacy recently came up when a war vet student in the Baltimore, Maryland area was banned from his campus after he wrote a paper for a writing class about his relationship to his training in the Army and his experiences of killing people. I should say that his teacher encouraged him to publish this in the school newspaper, and because his essay was then seen by his school administrators, they called him in for a meeting and banned him from campus until he was evaluated by a psychologist. Hope Davis, a college spokeswoman, said, "The violent and inflammatory content of Mr. Whittington's article raised some red flags we felt we needed to address in this post-Virginia Tech era. We have an obligation to maintain a safe and comfortable learning environment for the diverse population of nearly 74,000 students that